Okay, let's do just a little bit by way of review. At the end of the third journey, Paul and Luke and a handful of others are on their way back to Jerusalem. And what do they have with them that is of considerable importance? Money. All right, money from churches in Macedonia and Achaia. And that money was given for what purpose? All right, to help the needy saints in Jerusalem. Paul and his company go back to Jerusalem, and the Holy Spirit has been telling him all along, when you get there, you're going to run into trouble, bonds and affliction await. But Paul is determined to go to Jerusalem and to see this mission through. So he goes back to Jerusalem, delivers the funds to the elders of the church in Jerusalem, and the elders there have an idea to help Paul escape these Jewish persecutors. They say, we've got 4 men who have taken a vow, and you need to go up to the temple with them, observe the vow with them, and pay their expenses. And in so doing, you will perhaps convince your Jewish enemies that you are not a hater of the law, you are not an enemy of the Jews as they believe that you are, and you'll pacify them and maybe you'll escape with your life. Does it work? No. Paul escapes with his life, but the Jews come after him. They start to form a mob, and they are going to tear him limb from limb. Claudius Lysias, who's a Roman soldier, Roman captain of soldiers, steps in, puts a stop to it, and he begins to seek to ascertain why Paul is so hated by these Jews. Why was this disturbance being caused? He can't really get to the bottom of it. It seems to be just a dispute about religious things. It's not of any real grave concern to him. But he passes Paul on to the governor named Felix in Caesarea. Felix tries to figure out what's going on. Why is everybody so up in arms over this Paul character? And is he able to figure out anything? No. What does he determine about Paul? Is he guilty or innocent? All right, he's innocent. Paul hasn't done anything worthy of chains. He hasn't done anything worthy of death. But Luke tells us that wishing to do the Jews a favor, and Felix was also hoping that Paul would give him some bribe money, but Paul never did that. Felix left Paul in prison in Caesarea. For how long? All right, 2 years. Then Felix is summoned back to Rome by Caesar, and he is disgracefully removed from office. And his position is going to be filled by a man named Porcius Festus. All right, and that brings us to Acts chapter 25. Festus, verse 1, having arrived in the province of Palestine area, 3 days later went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. This is a very customary thing. Festus comes into this new province that he is now the governor of, and Jerusalem is really the epicenter of religious life in this province. And so it makes sense for him to go from Caesarea up to Jerusalem to say hello, let everybody see him, bring all the pomp and ceremony of Rome to Jerusalem. And so he goes up there to visit. And while he's there, there are some Jewish leaders who haven't forgotten about Paul. They still hate him. They still know that he is in prison in Caesarea, and they still want him dead. Okay? So these Jewish leaders then come to Festus, and they say, hey, we want to talk to you about this Paul fellow. Let's see what we can do about him. So in verse 3, it says that they were requesting a concession against Paul, that Festus might have Paul brought to Jerusalem. And at the same time, they would set an ambush to kill him on the way. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, they did that earlier, just a few chapters before. They wanted Paul to be summoned before the court, and as he was on his way to the Sanhedrin, there were 40 men who took a vow that said they wouldn't eat anything until Paul was dead. And so while Paul is traveling to the Sanhedrin, they're going to ambush him on the way and take his life. Paul's nephew discovers that, tells Paul, who tells Lysias, who then sends Paul on to Felix by night to keep him safe. So there's still some Jews in Jerusalem who still hate Paul. They want him dead, and they're seeking a favor from Festus. Hey, you need to go get Paul from Caesarea and bring him back to Jerusalem so that we can, rightly go through the proceedings, and yet all the while they're going to say, well, we're going to kill him on the way. Festus says, no, he's in Caesarea. If you have a problem, you need to come to Caesarea. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, did that back in Acts 24, all right? That's what Felix told the Jews. If you got a problem with him, you come to Caesarea. And that's when they brought that man named Tertullus, that great lawyer and orator who came and, oh, most excellent Felix, you're the greatest thing since sliced bread, and Paul's terrible, okay? So they're going to come to Caesarea now, and they're going to try this again. All right, Mel? Here we are 2 years later. They're still hungry, I guess. Yeah, they're still hungry. So, interesting point of contrast, though. On the earlier occasion, those men that took the vow, those were not the Jewish leaders, the chief priests, the scribes, the leaders of the Jews. In this instance, it is. So the leading men of the Jews are approaching Festus now. Now, of course, the leading men would have been in with it in the previous occasion, but they were not the ringleaders of it as they are now. So, verse 5, Festus said to them, let the influential men among you go there with me, that is Caesarea, with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. I just got this job, all right? I don't know anything about this Paul fella, and you're coming up bringing accusations about this man that he didn't become a prisoner when I was in charge here. I just moved here. I don't know anything about this. We need to have a little meeting in Caesarea if anything's going to happen here. Let me find out some more about this man, okay? So, verse 6 says, he spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them in Jerusalem. Then he went down to Caesarea. And on the next day, he's going to bring in Paul and start to question. Hey, listen, there's a lot of people in Jerusalem that don't like you, and we need to figure out what's going on, okay? I want to hear from you why it is that you're in prison and what's going on with all these Jews in Jerusalem who don't like you. So, verse 7, after Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him. And what does Luke add there at the end? Which they could not prove. Which they could not prove. They couldn't prove them on two grounds. One, 2 years had already passed. And so this is stuff that happened in the past. And you remember from a few chapters back, what was their primary accusation about Paul? He brought what kind of man into the temple? Now, he didn't do that, but they assumed that he brought a Gentile man. What evidence did they have of that? Did they see Trophimus the Ephesian in the temple? No. Yeah, they saw Paul and Trophimus walking the streets of Jerusalem together. They knew Trophimus was a Gentile, and so they made the assumption, hey, Paul goes up to the temple to observe his vow. I bet he took Trophimus in there with him. Now, that was wrong. They didn't have any evidence of that. So they're making these charges about Paul, which they could not prove. There were other charges that they brought as well, but Luke says they can't prove any of them. And so Paul in verse 8 stands up and he says, I haven't done anything wrong. These charges that they're making against me are all false. So Festus, verse 9, notice this same expression. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor. Why is it we keep reading about these Roman guys who want to do the Jews a favor? Why are they doing that? All right, Clark. All right, exactly. That's exactly right. The Romans were there they would say, we're here to keep peace. But the Roman definition of keeping peace is, you cause a problem, we squash you like a bug. And that's how we keep the peace, okay? But, which worked very effectively for a long time. You've got these obstinate people, the Jews, who are very sincere and devout in their religion. Their religion, monotheism, Jewish law, all of that is very different from Roman religion, pagan, polytheistic. And so the Romans, all the time, were ruffling religious feathers for the Jews because their religions didn't mix. And so the Jews were very accustomed to uprisings and riots, and Rome would just squash them. So the best thing you can do if you're a Roman governor is not have any uprisings. Try to keep the Jewish people calm. And so that's why we keep seeing this, wanting to do the Jews a favor. Don't cause any trouble for me, you Jews, because I'm up for a promotion here if I do a pretty good job for a few years, okay? Maybe they'll take me out of Jerusalem or out of Palestine and they'll move me somewhere more important, okay? So, wanting to do the Jews a favor, Festus answered Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges?" Paul's a smart man. He knows that he has a lot more enemies in Jerusalem than he does in Caesarea. All right? Yes, there are some Jewish men who have come from Jerusalem to Caesarea to seek these charges against him, but there are a lot more bloodthirsty men in Jerusalem. So he knows it's better to stay in Caesarea, if at all possible. And so that's what he says to Festus. Look, you've already got me here. I'm already in your custody. There's no sense in me going back to Jerusalem. Verse 10, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you very well know. Now, verse 11 is important. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. And that's the title of our lesson, because this is a very important expression. I appeal to Caesar. This is something that I don't fully understand, but I do know this. Every Roman citizen had this right. If you are a Roman and you felt like you were being misjudged or mistried or abused in your situation, you could appeal to Caesar. Now, you had to go through some processes to get there, kind of like our court system today. You can't just go to the county courthouse in Greenville County and say, I want to go to the Supreme Court directly. Well, you got to go through some steps to get there. But that's essentially what Paul does. I want to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was Caesar himself. Now, when Paul says this, Festus is a little bit confused. You only send people directly to Caesar when there's an actual case that has to be heard. What charges against Paul are standing? None. So we're going to send a man directly to Caesar who's unconvicted, a man who is allegedly said to have done all of these things, but there's no proof whatsoever. This is not exactly the kind of case that you send to the emperor, and Festus knows that. So if you look at verse 12, Festus had conferred with his council. Now, he doesn't tell us anything about what was said in that meeting, but I kind of imagine Festus was like, guys, what should I do here? This man wants to go to Caesar, but there's no charges that are sticking, and I'm not exactly sure what I should do here. So he says, all right, you've appealed to Caesar. I'm going to send you to Caesar. All right? Now, the rest of the book of Acts is basically Paul making his way to Rome to stand trial before Caesar. So, Festus continues hearing Paul's defenses. Argue your case. Defend yourself. He finds nothing wrong with him. Well, now there's another important dignitary who's going to come into the area, and that is Agrippa, Herod Agrippa II. This is the son of the Agrippa of Acts 12 who had James killed, okay? Herod Agrippa II. Now, again, customary thing. Festus is the new man in town, so what should Agrippa, who resides in Jerusalem, who is the king of the Jews, the leader of that city, the Jews in particular, what would you expect him to do when a new dignitary comes into office? Well, what do ours do? What do our ambassadors? Oh, we go give greetings, we send gifts, and all right, that's what he's doing. So Agrippa II and Bernice, if you look at verse 13, Bernice is his sister. It's believed that there might have been a little bit of an incestuous relationship going on between these two, but that's never really been confirmed. It was always supposed. People were mighty suspicious of it, but it was never confirmed. But anyways, they come to Caesarea to greet Festus. Now, this is good for Festus because Agrippa knows more about the Jews than Festus does. And so you've got Paul, who is a Jew, and you've got all these Jewish chief priests and leaders who are arguing with Paul, seemingly over a Jewish religious squabble. And so Festus says, this is great. Agrippa can help me. He knows more about the Jews than I do, and I can get his input here. And if he can help me fix this, I don't have to send Paul to Caesar. Okay? So, the rest of chapter 25 is setting the stage for Paul to stand before Agrippa and give his defense before him. Now, look at chapter 25 and verse 26, where Festus says to Agrippa, I have nothing definite to write to him, to the emperor, I have nothing definite to write about him, Paul, to write to my Lord, Caesar, the emperor. I don't have anything to say about Paul to the emperor. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me, in sending a prisoner, not to indicate also the charges against him. All right? Agrippa, I need your help. All right? Now, I've already answered question number 1 for us. Festus wants Paul to speak to Agrippa so Agrippa can help Festus determine some charges. Is it worthy to send Paul to Rome or not? All right, Glenn. Or at least have a reason to send him to Caesar. Why does it say later that he might have been released? I don't know if Festus had the power to release him or not, but it was Agrippa who said that. That's at the end of chapter 26 and verse 32. And let me come back to that in a moment. But I don't know if Festus could make the judgment call of, when you said, I want to go to Caesar, could Festus have changed that? I don't know. I hadn't considered that. So Festus reaches out to Agrippa. I need your help. Chapter 26 is Paul's defense before Agrippa. And we're not going to analyze this, but let's just look at a couple of things that are said toward the end. Look at chapter 26, and Paul spends, as I said, most of this chapter giving his defense. This is what happened. I was traveling to Damascus to persecute the Christians. Jesus appeared to me on the road. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I'm going to send you to the Gentiles to proclaim the gospel to them, to turn them from the darkness and power of Satan, to turn them to light, etc. Then verse 24. While Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad. You're crazy. And Paul responds, verse 25, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. For the king knows about these matters, and I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. The king knows about these matters. Agrippa is who he's talking about. Agrippa knows this stuff is true. This all has happened in the wide open space. Him being the king in Jerusalem, he knows about all of this. Certainly he has heard about the Jews and their response toward me. Agrippa knows all of this. And so verse 27, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. Festus has written him off. You're crazy. You're insane. No, I'm not. But I'm going to turn my attention to Agrippa. Agrippa, do you believe the scriptures? Do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. And then Agrippa says, verse 28, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. You almost persuade me to become a Christian. And we sing that as an invitation song, almost persuaded. People have argued about what's the best way to understand Agrippa's words here. Is he really genuinely saying, Paul, you are almost persuading me to obey the gospel? Or is he kind of saying sarcastically, oh yeah, you just keep talking, you're going to turn me into a Christian. Yeah, I'm so close, Paul. I tend to think it's the former because of what Paul says in response. Verse 29, he says, I would wish to God that whether in a short or a long time, not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. What is Paul? He's a Christian. I wish everybody here would become like me, except for the fact that I'm wearing shackles. So I tend to think that Agrippa was saying, Paul, you're tugging at my heartstrings here. And again, we talked about Felix last week, who said, come back when I have a more convenient time. And I mentioned that a lot of preachers have, waxed eloquently on that expression. A lot of preachers have done it on this one too. You almost persuade me to become a Christian. And so, verse 30, King stood up, the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with them, and when they had gone aside, they began talking to one another, saying, this man is not doing anything worthy of death or imprisonment. We can't find anything wrong with this man. And then Agrippa says, verse 32, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. If he had not said that, based on my judgment plus your judgment, we agree he's not doing anything wrong. We could have let this man go, or we would have let this man go. Now, whether they could have or not, I'm not sure. But we would have done it because there's nothing here holding this man. All right. So, Paul's got to go to Rome. Paul is going to be sent on a series of ships, not just one, but a series of ships that set out from Caesarea, and he's going to journey to Rome. And Clark, did you have your hand up? I want the comment, not the question. Yeah, that's a good point. Jesus has already said to Paul, you will see Rome, right? We talked about that last week. Jesus gave him that assurance. Yes, there's a lot of persecution and people seeking your life, but you will see Rome. So I think maybe that needs to be a factor in this discussion too. Jesus is, and I think especially we see this as he journeys to Rome. There are a number of curious things that seem coincidental, but I don't think they are. God is ensuring that Paul makes it to Rome. And it's better for him to do it with the safety and security of Roman soldiers than to try to make it on his own. That's a good point. I had not considered that. All right. It's time to send Paul to Rome. Paul is given a liberty that most prisoners are not. Let's look at question number 2. Who accompanied Paul on the ship that was headed for Rome, according to the first 2 verses of Acts 27? Luke and Aristarchus. All right, Aristarchus is from the city of Thessalonica. He was of that small group of people traveling with Paul, carrying the money from Macedonia and Achaia to Jerusalem. Acts 20 and verse 4 mentions him along with those other men who are traveling with Paul. Aristarchus and Luke are on that ship with Paul while he's in prison, and they are going to accompany him to the city of Rome. So Paul gets to take with him a couple of travel buddies. Most prisoners were not given that privilege. But again, Paul is not your typical prisoner. There's no charges against him. So they're going to carry him, but Paul is given considerable liberty and license. Now, Acts 27, first few verses of Acts 28 tell us about their journey, the ship that they take, ships that they take, I should say, their journey to Rome and some of the problems that they ran into. Ultimately, of course, shipwreck and having to get to Rome in much more difficult circumstances. Again, we're not going to analyze these verses in these chapters, but as we think about some of these things, it's interesting all the things that Luke says here. Luke records in very specific detail, as Luke is prone to do, being the doctor that he is. We sailed to this city and we stopped, and then we went to this city and we went on this side of the island as opposed to the other side. And Luke is being very detailed about the path that they took to travel to Rome. Back in the 1840s, there was a man by the name of James Smith who basically took Luke's record in Acts and he wanted to see how accurate it was. He wanted to see if what Luke said in the book of Acts about their journey to Rome was true. And so he got on a ship and he went over to Caesarea and he set out following Luke's charted course to go to the the city of Rome, and he wrote a book about it. And his conclusion in all of that was that Luke's account is extremely accurate, that Luke described the conditions of the area perfectly. He described it as a good eyewitness would have done. And his book is called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. It was published in 1848. It's public domain now. It's so old. You just Google it, and you can find a PDF of it, and you can read it if you want to. I read a little bit of it yesterday. I'll tell you, it's kind of tedious reading. A lot of guys in the mid-1800s were, mentioned waxing eloquently earlier. Some of those books that are 100-plus years old, they're, why take 5 words to say what you could say in 105, right? So, but if you want to read it, it's out there. So, they set out for Rome. Now, look at some things that happen as they are making this trip. Let's see what kind of time we got. Okay. Chapter 27, verse 1. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius, and embarking in an Adramyttian ship. Now, if you look on your map on page 27, or the second page of your lesson, if you look at Asia, or modern Turkey, look toward the northern part of Asia, you'll see a city there called Adramyttium. You see that on your map? All right, that's where this ship was from. Now, that's not where they got on the ship. They got on it in Caesarea, but this ship was from that city. I don't know exactly why it was in Caesarea, but it was. And so they're going to take that ship and start their journey back. Now, if you follow the red path on your map, what do you notice about the line leaving from Caesarea, traveling north, then turning to the west, and going down to the island of Crete? What do you notice about the path that the ship is taking? I'm sorry? All right, it's close to the shore. Ronnie, why would they do that? Okay. Paul is traveling with all these other men at a pretty dangerous time of the year to be traveling, okay? So it's stormy weather. It's getting to be the time of year where sea storms are very, very regular at this time of the year, and so you try to hug the coast as closely as you can because it's safer that way. Now, what I know about seafarer or navigating ships on the ocean can be written on a Post-it note, and a small one at that. So don't ask me any questions about it. But that's why they're doing that, all right? They're going to hug the coast as much as they can. Now, after they leave Crete, that island where they have hugged the coast all up until that, then what do they do as they get out in the Mediterranean? Now they're in open water. Now it's much more dangerous because there's no land for them to stay close to. So they've got to go out to the open water, and that's where they start to run into their trouble, okay? But if you follow the path, they leave from Caesarea, they go up to Sidon, and then if you look at chapter 27 and verse, where is it? Verse 3. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. They leave Caesarea, they jump up to Sidon, and Paul gets to have some time to go off and see his Christian friends. And you think all the other prisoners were able to do that? No, I really doubt that. So Paul goes and he sees his friends, whatever. Then they're going to set out once again. And then from there they leave and they sail on the north side of the island of Cyprus. Then they go over into Lycia, and there's another city on your map there called Myra. They stop right there and they change ships. This time they go, look at verse 6, they land at Myra in Lycia, and there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. Now this ship from Alexandria in Egypt is the breadbasket of Rome. That's where a lot of their wheat and grain was grown, and so this Alexandrian ship has grain on it. We know that from later when the ship starts to run into trouble, they start throwing everything overboard to lighten the weight of the ship, and they throw the grain overboard. So this is a grain ship that's headed toward Rome. to carry that grain there. And so, hey, can you throw on about 300 people there as well? And so there's 276 people, Luke tells us, that get on that ship, and they start to go toward Rome. Now, look at chapter 27 and verse 10. Paul said to the men on the ship, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." Paul gives this warning. This is not going to turn out the way we want it to. But then the centurion goes and speaks to the captain of the ship. "What do you think?" "We'll be okay. We'll make it." And so he decides to listen to the pilot, the captain of the ship. And so in chapter 27 and verse 12, the harbor was not suitable for wintering. The majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. All right, weather's starting to turn bad. We really need to stop, but we can't stop here, so let's keep going. Maybe we'll get to Crete, and we'll be safe there. They start headed that direction. Paul's been saying, hey, we don't need to do this. This is going to turn out bad, but they decided that they needed to do that. So in verse 14, before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind, or a northeaster. There's kind of a strange word that's used there in verse 14, but a northeasterly wind. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it, and we let ourselves be driven along. And now this shipwreck process is going to begin. Things are going to start to get really bad. Look at verse 21. When they'd gone a long time without food, Paul stood up in their midst, and he said, "I told you so. Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong and to whom I serve stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you.'" We're going to make it. We're going to escape with our lives. We're going to lose everything else, but we're going to make it. Now, something just occurred to me having read that verse, and it relates to this discussion we were having about Paul standing before Caesar, God's providence being a part of this. Paul is going to have preaching opportunities to the household of Caesar. We know that from Philippians. Philippians chapter 1, Philippians chapter 4 rather. Paul says there are those in Caesar's household who are obeying the gospel. And if Paul had not appealed to Caesar, that would have not happened. So that's a factor in this as well. So whatever that adds to the discussion. All right, now they keep going. They're going to eventually run aground, which is not good for a ship, and they're going to shipwreck. And if you look at chapter 27 and verse 33, Paul tells the men, hey, we've been doing this 14 days. We've been fighting this storm. Here we've shipwrecked. You guys haven't eaten anything. Take a rest. Get something to eat. Then verse 37 is where we learn that there were 276 people on the ship. And then 38 is where we learn that this was a grain ship. They were throwing the wheat out into the sea. And then verse 39, the day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay at the beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. So they're gonna cast down their anchors, and they're going to try and bring this ship to safety. Then they come to the island of Malta. And this is interesting, because when they finally get to land and they get settled there on Malta, they're cold. They've been out in the water, and they're wet, and they're cold, and so they want to build a fire. And so they gather up a bunch of sticks to build the fire. And what happens to be in the sticks? All right, a snake. I love that when that happens, And the snake jumps out, bites Paul on the arm. The local people say, that's a poisonous snake. We know that. We used to play with snakes when we were kids, and you didn't play with that kind of snake. So they're expecting Paul to fall over dead at any moment, but he never does. So then they say, wow, you must be one of the gods, and we're going to worship you. And as Paul has had to deal with this before, no, don't do that. But they obviously see that Paul is somebody that the gods want alive. And so they're going to treat him with great respect and honor. And chapter 28 and in verse, I'm sorry, Donna, you had your hand up. Oh, okay, yeah, good question. Look at verse 27. When the 14th night came, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise all right, Adriatic Sea. Look on your map, and you'll see the Adriatic Sea is between Italy and Macedonia. And yet, that seems to be way out of the way from the path that they took. I knew somebody was going to ask me that question, so I did some reading about that. The Adriatic was not limited in the way that it is on this map. So, in other words, the Adriatic would flow in their minds. They would speak a little bit more generally and freely. The Adriatic flowed all the way down into the Mediterranean. And so we would look at that and say, he's clearly in the Mediterranean. You've got that Ionian Sea there in between. But for them, they would just speak of one as another, and it all just kind of flowed together. So, yeah, it may have depended on where the people were from. That's true. So they were not as well defined in their language as the map was. They would speak a little more generally. At least that's what 3 or 4 books that I read said about it. Well, yes, I guess there were areas where you could define it clearly, and then where maybe with 2 seas would come together. You know, how well do you define it? Do you just let them run together? That seems to be the consensus of everything that I've read. Now, that's not satisfactory to you, I can tell by the look on your face. And quite frankly, it's not for me either. But it's going to take a little bit more reading on my part to answer that more sufficiently. All right, Dan. Okay. All right. Good observation. All right. Now. All right. We didn't quite get to Rome, but we'll do that next week.